Everything's now ready for the cameras. The ground has been prepared for them, and like the principal guests at the party, they're escorted carefully in.
Training in, I suppose, right up to the end of the 70s wasn't about being trained to be a film director or a film producer or a film cutter or whatever, but actually to be a BBCer.
I got a degree in Oxford in 1960, then I did a year's teaching in America. Then I came back to England and asked around among friends what there was to do, and they said, well, people who don't know what they want to do tend to go into television. I
remember in Oxford, in my year, everybody either tried to get into the Foreign Office, and if they couldn't do that, they went to the BBC.
I was never trained. My first training course I ever got when I became managing director of Scottish. So I managed to go 20 years without being trained in television.
You could spend weeks and weeks and weeks experimenting because there was that time available. The employment conditions then were such that if you needed extra people, you just brought them in. And you didn't bring them in on a contract, you brought them in on a trainee basis, or you brought them in on a higher level, and you took them in as part of the team because you could afford to do it.
When I went into performing in front of the camera and in front of the microphones, I had absolutely no training whatsoever. And in fact, the series I did with Miriam Margulies, we had a young production assistant who had just joined the current affairs department, whose name was Esther Ranson, who came to give us some notes on our performances. It was very amateur, it was very hit and miss.
The best training you should have was to work as a sort of usherette or usher at the Granada Mansfield Cinema. This, according to our founder, imbued you with a sense of show business, after which you learned by going around various departments.
I did my interview. It was for assistant transmission controller, brackets trainee. I had no idea what it was. I couldn't find out in advance, but I had to answer questions like evidence of manual dexterity and things like that. So I claimed to type and I claimed to mend my own car, I seem to remember.
Granada, which saw itself as, you know, the BBC of the independent sector, would go on its milk round of all the top universities and pick the top talent. So really, we didn't really want to train. We wanted to believe that we had natural talent there that would be allowed to develop in whatever anarchic way it chose.
People were doing a job, but it didn't matter how long it took. It didn't matter how much it cost. We just had to make television programs. That was all that people were bothered about.
I did once try and include what I thought of as a proper item within the budget. And I went to David Attenborough, who was then director of programs, and said, I appear to be £60,000 overspent. I see the studio is down here in the books as £20,000 a day. I'm going to do 3 films, can I have my money back, please? And he said, you don't understand, it doesn't work quite like that.
Mostly you were actually watching somebody else who could do the job and actually sort of learning on the job, but without the expectation that you would earn, for want of a better term.
Jobs for Life was exactly the deal in the BBC, but it was not only, it was a deal in most industries. You know, certainly in big organisations, people expected that they would continue for the rest of their lives and would retire.
The job I came in as was an administrative trainee, but that didn't mean that I actually had a job. What it meant was that I was joining a scheme whereby people who were on the scheme were looked after, so to speak, by a member of what I would now call, I suppose, a management training operation. And this person would ensure that over a period of up to 2 years, you would be moved on attachment from one part of the BBC to other parts of the BBC.
I had a very well-paid job, even as a trainee, which was then, I was then promoted up through the ranks. And had a job in a pension scheme and got paid if I was sick.
We learned the job just simply by sitting with the editors, with you know, talking to the more experienced journalists, and also by having a big team and big budgets. So we only had to make 2 or 3 shows a year. You could afford to get it wrong.
Off I went to Belfast with 2 weeks training, and ended up working on what was their World in Action called Spotlight, with an editor called Chris Wade. And it was on reversal, and I didn't know what reversal was. And I was left to sync up for 2 days, and I sank it up on the pick sync, and it was scratched to ribbons. So I was sent home from Belfast.
There was a laissez-faire attitude. I mean, people were just, you know, I got away with it. I had no training at all, but managed to bluff my way through as an assistant film editor.
I can think of only one other black person that was employed by the company at the time. And in fact, even then he wasn't on staff. It was shortly after that that he actually came on staff. There were a couple of Asian people, I think, but I don't think any of them were there full time.
BBC Cardiff was just a corridor of men, and I was the only girl at BBC Cardiff, and I found that quite sort of daunting. There weren't very many women assistants in the cutting rooms, and I don't know why, because I would say it was a woman's job, really, keeping it tidy. Well, I mean, that's the basic thing. You look after the editor. It's a bit like being a cutting room wife.
When I arrived, it was during the famous autumn 1979 strike in ITV, which is a very curious time to be joining a television company.
The unions were very strong at that time, and your ticket, I mean, it was catch-22 to work. Then you had to be outside the BBC. You had to have a union ticket, and to get a union ticket you had to work, so it was catch-22.
My first memory of working in television was fairly short-lived because we were out on strike after a matter of weeks. A strike which lasted several months. We were all actually out the door, almost unheard of these days.
There was a small team of managers who were responsible for ensuring that the vital services of the building continued to function, even though nobody was working there at all.